Alright, well, people wanted more of this silliness, so here we go. This is the Splatoon manga, and we're in the single arc where they actually played ranked modes, analyzing the gameplay and tactics at a level of detail that the manga has no intention of actually living up to. This match will not be featuring Goggles' shenanigans for once because Team Blue isn't playing. Instead, we're looking at Team Gloves, a team of fairly friendly, well-adjusted players that Team Blue cheers for, versus Team X-Blood. It's for 10-year-olds, it's for 10-year-olds, it's for 10-year-olds, it's for 10-year-olds. Okay, I'm good. Team X-Blood are the final bosses of this arc, so this battle is an opportunity to characterize them for that final showdown with Team Blue, showing their power levels and their tactics a little bit. The group was formed by Vintage, the captain, inviting the top players in X rank to all be on a team together. Vintage plays ballpoint, makes sense. There's a Tetris player, which makes sense in a vacuum, but not at all for this comp. There's a Nautilus, which was a strong main weapon, but the baller kit the manga character uses was all but never used competitively after the Inkjet kit came out. You only ever really saw it in solo queue in my experience. This is a really poor choice to pair with Tetradulies. Both of them want their teammates to paint for them, because they aren't good at doing that themselves and have other priorities they'd much rather focus on instead. It's also generally not great to have a Nautilus and a Ballpoint on the same comp, because both of them have significant downtime, moments in game where they have to back up, take safe positions, charge their weapons before they can re-engage. They'd both prefer for other weapons to start fights for them to finish, instead of getting in there in committal positions where they might get caught without a charge if they're not careful. Sometimes double splatling is also a paint liability, but the Ballpoint paint's fine, so that's not a problem here. Finally, there's a Bloblobber player, which is a surprising person for them to have found at the top of the X-Rank leaderboards, but there are a few top Japanese blob players out there making it work in a couple modes. Pretty rare to see competitively, though. In one aspect, the Bloblobber's not a bad fit for this comp, since both the Nautilus and the Tetras are going to need a lot of paint to function, and the Bloblobber can play a pretty high paint supportive playstyle. I don't think it's great, though, because we already have an Anchor in the Ballpoint and a midline Slayer in the Nautilus that will both want someone else to be starting fights for them. Picking a weapon as passive and slow as the Bloblobber is going to put a lot of pressure on the Tetradulies to stay alive and apply pressure, because they're this team's only source of that, and it puts a lot of pressure on the midline to keep up with the Tetras, forcing them to take a lot of positions they won't feel super comfortable in if they follow up with the Tetras and give them the support they'll need to function. Except that none of that is actually the way that this will work, because this is the manga and not the competitive video game. I guess maybe if you really want to give far more credit to the story than it deserves, you could try to argue that this comp is the result of picking the top players off the leaderboard instead of looking for weapons that actually synergize with each other, that maybe it's a subtle condemnation of the team that prides themselves so heavily on their rank and looks down on those who haven't succeeded as they have on the leaderboards. They are the villains in a Nintendo game, after all. They aren't allowed to understand the power of friendship and teamwork. But I'm well past the point of thinking to give it that much credit. I go over the specials these weapons had in Splatoon 2, but none of them are actually shown using special weapons during this battle, so we can skip that part for them. Team Gloves, meanwhile, has Splat Dualies, Dualie Squelchers, Splat Roller, and Splat Charger. V-Dualies were an interesting weapon that I played a decent amount during the N-Parries meta. They had Burst Bomb and Missiles, while the more common kits for competitive play were the N-Parries with Curling Bomb Inkjet, and the Kensa Dualies with Suction Bomb Baller, when Baller was a strong option. N-Parries in particular had a run as what many players considered the strongest weapon in the game, one of the fastest pushing weapons in the game, with an aggressive special that paired very nicely with its high mobility that let it get into strong inkjet positions when it wanted to. V-Dualies, by contrast, had Missiles, which, while strong, required a pretty passive positioning to get maximum value from. You may have noticed if you were watching competitive Splatoon 2 that there weren't a lot of highly aggressive Missiles weapons. Most of the ones that saw a lot of use were at least somewhat supportive and played around the special more as opposed to the main weapons. Splat Dualies aren't a great main weapon for that, because that means that they're not going to get as much use out of the dodge rolls, which are best suited to diving into enemy ink to splat people, or surviving risky plays that other weapons wouldn't have the burst movement to escape. I really enjoyed playing a slightly more passive playstyle in between dives into the enemy team, going in with my own missiles and poking with burst bombs in the meantime, but I was in the minority there. Vanilla Dualie Squelchers were a decent, reliable option, especially in late-game Splatoon 2, and the missiles they got were a high priority, though the lack of a bomb made it so that a lot of people preferred the custom kit with the Splat Bombing Storm instead. No one uses any sub-weapons in this match, which seems to be a trend for the manga for some reason, so maybe that's not as big of a deal for them. Splat Roller had Curling Bomb Splashdown, so one of the best sub-weapons it could have, with the worst special you could give any weapon in Splatoon 2. The one special which, at top level, was more likely to get you splatted than to do anything useful, unless you used it out of a super jump. It's not a terrible choice, the team has a decent amount of paint to support it, but it never saw a significant amount of competitive use, it never entered the meta, and it's a weapon that demands the entire team change their win condition from being whatever else they'd like to do to supporting the roller instead. The Charger was never a bad weapon in Splatoon 2, with Splat Bomb arguably the best sub-weapon in the game and Stingray arguably the best special that's ever been in any Splatoon game. You have to be careful with backline weapons to make sure that your team has enough pushing power, since the Charger isn't exactly going to be able to clear a way for the Rainmaker, but they basically have enough pushing power here, though the Roller isn't so much a weapon that pushes as it is a weapon that sets up ambushes. They'll rely on the dually Squelchers to initiate engagements, and then for the other members of the team to find ways to get splats from the distraction. The dualies can also set up fights with missiles and the Charger with Stingray. It's not a terrible comp, but it's also not a comp that would have been seen at top level in competitive play at basically any time during the game's meta that I was around. Again, not that any of that matters, because the manga is not that deep. Match starts, and in one of the better details in the whole match, Team X-Blood gets to the shield first. Players with better mechanical skill are going to have more optimized movement that wins this race across the map against less experienced opponents. It's one of those subtle skills that a lot of people wouldn't pick up just from watching a high-level tournament match, but that you realize makes a huge difference when you actually play against a higher-level team. If you're looking for some surprisingly good mechanics practice, get your teammates into a PB and have races from spawn to the center of the map. It's a great test of your movement abilities. Team X-Blood gets the pop, and then make a mistake no one at the top of the actual X-Rank leaderboards would ever make, picking the Rainmaker up right away instead of winning a fight first. The Rainmaker would be a bottom tier if it were an option to bring into battle. It's incredibly slow, and it doesn't have a sub or special weapon. Picking it up before they gain more of an advantage makes it more likely that Team Gloves stops the Rainmaker and then has a numbers advantage and pushes it back further in the opposite direction. That gets close to happening here, as both sets of dualies get in the way once the Rainmaker makes it into the enemy street. Realistically, a team is never going to be so slow to rush out into mid that this is the first place the defending team puts up any resistance. The Rainmaker fires a shot at them, and being dualies in this manga, they avoid it by dodge rolling. What happens next doesn't make a lot of sense, it's kind of hard to track. After dualies dodge roll in the main game, they start firing with a higher fire rate and only a single reticle. Dodge rolling leads to a firing mode with really high damage output, and so you'd think that dodging the shot, they'd immediately just shoot the Rainmaker carrier. But I guess they just keep dodge rolling? And the Rainmaker just kind of runs past them? It's maybe possible that what's happening is that the dualies are rolling off this ledge and landing below, so the Rainmaker has high ground? That would make the most sense, even though they're clearly not starting from a position where the Rainmaker shot can force them that far away from where they want to be. Anyway, the Rainmaker gets in view of the goal, and they still haven't actually fired a shot at it. Look at this area on the map. It's a massive choke point, and there are 2 players guarding it. She really just kind of walks past them. Then the Tetris player comes in and dodge rolls past them, just like they dodge rolled past the Rainmaker. Again, nobody appears to have fired any shots yet. It's only once the Tetris player and Vintage get into an argument that anyone actually fires, and the dualies take out the Tetris while the Squelchers player takes out the exposed Rainmaker, which, while distracted, does appear to have kept moving as the score ticks down from 34 to 9 during all of the pointless somersaulting. The best idea for Team Gloves at this point is to pop the Rainmaker shield but then leave the Rainmaker in their base while they push back out into mid. Then the Rainmaker will reset in mid, and they can wait to pick it up until after they've won a fight, and they'll spend less time holding the slow, vulnerable Rainmaker, and have more time to push once they do decide to pick it up. The manga sort of acknowledges this as a strategy when later in the match Team X-Blood resets the Rainmaker by jumping it off the ledge, but that's a more desperate tactic for when the defense is being overwhelmed and doesn't have enough control to stop the opposing side from picking it up after they pop it. The team runs into mid with the Rainmaker all in a clump, all standing right on each other's toes. No one securing any high ground positions, no one taking positions near cover, and clearly no one collecting information about enemy positions, because then Team X-Blood fully surround them and perform the special attack of surrounding them and shooting at them. I don't really see what's particularly special about this, that it needs a name. but I guess it's at least on brand for them. See? They make an X! Succumb to the X. Ew, why? Gag, why? They made him a serial killer. Why is this so pointlessly, insanely edgy? Barf. Blah. Okay, anyway, tactically speaking, this is a terrible idea, and it only works because Team Gloves' formation is actually the worst that it can possibly be. Everyone's on low ground, in the most obvious position on the map with no cover, clumped up, so they'd get multi-killed by any AoE. When they go down, they're going to paint each other's feet. Like, I can't think of a worse position for them to be in. They need players pushing ahead of the Rainmaker to intercept defenders before they reach it. And they need to spread out enough that shooting at one of them doesn't constitute shooting at all of them. There's an enemy backliner, so they need to be pressuring high ground positions to not give them the grates above their heads. That's probably the single most powerful ballpoint splatling position in the entire game. It's just a mess. If Team Gloves had played this even slightly more orthodox, they'd be able to exploit a really significant weakness in Team X-Blood's silly positioning, namely that everyone is isolated. If they were to run multiple members at any individual member of X-Blood, they would have had an advantageous fight against them, gain a numbers advantage, and be able to start snowballing from there. This formation only works precisely because Team Gloves blundered into it so badly. But if they spread out literally anywhere else at all, they bump into a member of X-Blood. Is this voice getting tiresome? Don't care. I had to read this manga, and now you have to suffer with me. And they should just be able to overwhelm them with numbers. Is there no one that can escape this highly concentrated attack? It's literally impossible for the enemy team to pull off unless you all stand in exactly the same spot and let two of them flank you without being seen at all. It's unclear which side belongs to which team here, but they either got crossed up by a ballpoint splatling or a bloblobber without noticing. Use your map button, y'all. Nothing will change. X-Fall. You won't get away. The X-Fall is still unbeatable. Why? Why do we do this? Why do we train young boys to think this sociopathic nonsense is cool? Okay, so they lose the Rainmaker in mid as far as I can tell, but then the blob player picks it up and jumps it off the map to reset it anyway? Why? It's just going back to exactly the same place you picked it up from. Are you taunting them? Are you trying to tank your KD ratio on purpose? Unless their progress was dramatically misrepresented, this is one of the most counterproductive Rainmaker resets I've ever seen. Now, Vintage describes the team's plan here, which is to take their push to 9 and then just play defense for the rest of the game instead of pushing for a KO. And that does have some merit. If they're given a free opportunity to push, though, which they clearly have here since the other team got wiped all at once, they should still pick the Rainmaker up and move it further into enemy territory. They don't have to try and push for a larger lead or the KO, but the further back Team Gloves has to start their counter push, the harder it's going to be to even get to mid, let alone get points on the board. This is a way that Team X-Blood are going to be able to stall the game out more effectively than if they have to fight in neutral from mid. X-Blood just kind of stand around in mid, waiting for Team Gloves to do something, and then Team Gloves sends in a player with the Rainmaker by themselves. Now, how they popped the Rainmaker shield and then picked it up all without getting shot at by themselves by a whole team of 4 that's watching this, I don't know, but let's just pretend that that makes sense. At first, it looks like they're alone, but then Team Gloves launches 2 sets of Tentamissiles and a Stingray all at the same time. First of all, with the Rainmaker this far forward, there's plenty of time for, say, the Tetras to just drop off, splat the Rainmaker carrier, and then still not die to all the specials being launched. But ignoring that, this is still a weak play, as we've described earlier, in that the specials are all being used at once. So it'll displace the enemy team for a few seconds, but then Team Gloves will have nothing left. There's also no one in position to follow up on these specials, so they're a lot less likely to do anything. Stingray's a lot like Crab Tank. If you don't have someone pushing up while it goes out, it's definitely possible to splat someone, but it's a lot harder and less reliable, so there should always be a frontliner ready to move in and use the smokescreen and the chip damage to secure splats. X-Blood does what you would expect and dodges all of these specials, at which point everyone on Team Good Guy celebrates because they've spent 3 of the best specials in the game that didn't splat anyone, but they broke the X-Fall formation. And by that we mean we forced them into an objectively better formation, albeit a little further back on the map now. It's a little unclear exactly what's happening in these panels, whether the Blob and Tetris players are getting splatted or just zoned out, but Team Gloves keeps themselves up and makes some progress. Gloves, the Doolies player, starts feeling himself and makes a half-taunting remark that maybe he's getting up to the level of an X-rank player now. This is an oddly realistic depiction, though I don't think it's for the reasons the mangaka intended. When you first play against a team made of strong competitive players, a team that's really way out of your league, a lot of players will, say, get a splat, and feel surprised that they were able to. Feel like, oh wow, these guys aren't so invincible after all. On one hand, yeah, that can be a useful confidence boost, like, never just resign yourself to losing to someone. But on another level, it can actually be a bit of a problem. Here's a clip of me splatting Shaq from FT Win. That seems like a cool thing on its face, but this play was a terrible idea. I'm surrounded by enemy ink with no teammates around to help, and the absolute best case scenario is that I trade. The reason I trade instead of getting splatted immediately is that this play is such a bad idea that no one was actually expecting it. So yeah, I splatted Shaq, but being proud of that, reinforcing this really bad decision, is actually counterproductive. Don't get intimidated to the point that you don't think, and if you get a clean pick, good job, what you did worked. But also realize that if you splat a top player after, say, they've splatted 3 of your teammates, they look at that as a win. They won the engagement. That's not something for you to be proud of. In response to the display of confidence from Gloves, Vintage absolutely blows a gasket. He starts seeing red. As if these imbeciles obsessed with having fun could ever become X-rank. Like, bro. Yeah, X-rank is higher than most people will ever get, but the biggest determining factor is just how much of a priority you make the game in your life. If they put in time and effort, most people can get there eventually. I've been X-rank since 2018, even in Splatoon 2 where it was harder to stay there, and it's not anywhere near the achievement I'm most proud of with this game. I made a video where I listed and explained the progression in skill from having never played a video game before to being the very best player of Splatoon ever. And we hit X-rank 11 minutes into that 30-minute video. There is so much more beyond just hitting X-rank, and this is not the sort of thing a top player actually feels proud of. So then he turns into Sans, Megalovania starts playing non-diegetically, and Teen Gloves proceeds to have a bad time. I don't really know what X-Zone is supposed to mean. Is it that he's in the zone? Is it that he's playing a zone defense? Vintage just kind of gets a quad and ends the game by himself. So it's another named special attack that's just kind of the default thing you're trying to do in that situation and isn't actually a unique tactic. Time's up. They only made it to 23. Whoa, villain's scary. Never take the X lightly. Goggles is going to pull this guy's pants down.